Opening the center, this pawn immediately contests central space, setting the stage for piece development and potential pawn breaks. Instantly contesting the center and preparing for pawn advances, Black opts for a flexible defense. Establishing central pawn presence, 2c4 immediately contests Black's knight's control and opens avenues for rapid development. Opening the path for the bishop, this pawn advance prepares to contest the center and fosters piece development. Solidifying central presence, nf3 prepares for queenside expansion while eyeing potential tactical jabs. Challenging White's central space, Black establishes a solid pawn chain and aims for active piece play. Solidifying central control and preparing for knight activity, this move naturally develops a piece towards the heart of the action. Developing the bishop here prepares for kingside castling, a sensible step to secure the monarch. Developing the bishop here pins the knight, creating immediate tactical potential and restricting Black's central pawn breaks for the moment. Safeguarding the monarch against potential knight incursions on g5 is a prudent immediate priority, setting the stage for future pawn breaks. Solidifying the center and preparing development, this move aims for a stable queen's gambit declined structure, offering a harmonious pawn formation while keeping options open for piece maneuvering. Challenging the bishop's influence immediately prevents it from becoming a persistent thorn in Black's kingside, though it does create a slight pawn weakness on the kingside that might require careful defensive maneuvering later. Safeguarding the bishop's post becomes paramount as White repositions it, preserving its influence on the long diagonal and maintaining flexibility, while Black's king's side development faces subtle pressure. Opening up the queenside, Black prepares to develop the bishop to b7, aiming to pressure White's central pawn structure and potentially control the long diagonal, a sensible long-term plan that also offers a degree of counterplay against White's slightly cramped kingside setup. Opening the center now allows pieces to breathe and can accelerate development, but also potentially exposes your king's flank if not handled precisely. Releasing the central tension with knight recapture allows Black to solidify their pawn structure and prepare for queenside development, but it also opens the d-file for potential White pressure. Sacrificing the bishop pair here simplifies the position dramatically, removing a key attacker and simplifying the central pawn structure, potentially leading to a more tactical middle game where piece activity will be paramount. Recapturing the bishop with the queen immediately re-establishes material equality and centralizes the queen, preparing for potential skirmishes on the d-file. Exchanging the knight opens a crucial diagonal for the queen and aims to simplify into an advantageous middle game structure, where White's bishop pair can become a significant long-term asset, potentially creating weaknesses around Black's king. Reclaiming the central pawn opens up the queen, preparing to contest the d-file and potentially launch a counterattack, though it does leave the e-pawn somewhat exposed. Developing the bishop to a more active diagonal, this move aims to establish pressure along the e2-h5 diagonal, potentially eyeing Black's kingside castled position. The bishop finds a more active square, aiming to contest the crucial e-file and prepare for potential pawn breaks, while also providing defensive support for its kingside. A bold repositioning, the knight aims to occupy a critical central square, disrupting Black's pawn structure and potentially eyeing vulnerable kingside targets if Black carelessly neglects their defense. Striking at the center's heart, this counterblow immediately challenges White's knight and aims to disrupt the pawn chain, seeking active piece play and potential queenside expansion. Castling securely tucks your monarch away from the immediate skirmishes, solidifying a strong defensive perimeter while preparing the rook for potential action on the newly opened center files. Bringing the rook to the d-file immediately intensifies the central struggle, preparing to contest this open highway and potentially launch a devastating pawn break with c4 if White isn't careful, while simultaneously adding an extra layer of defense to the d5 pawn and subtly hinting at future coordinated rook activity. The rook glides to the c-file, immediately contesting the open highway and preventing Black from establishing an unchallenged presence there, subtly aiming to restrict the mobility of the queenside pieces and prepare for future infiltration. Pushing this pawn forward aggressively challenges the knight's central presence, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and gain space on the kingside, though it does create a potential weakness on the g6 square. A daring sortie aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and create tactical chaos. However, it leaves the knight somewhat stranded and potentially vulnerable to a swift counterattack, demanding careful calculation from white to justify the immediate positional concessions. The knight's foray to g6 puts immense pressure on black's kingside, threatening a devastating fork with nd4 or even a discovered attack. Instead of passively defending, the queen's repositioning to d6 activates her to support the c5 pawn, offers a potential escape square on e7 if the knight continues its aggressive advance, and importantly, prepares for future counterplay along the d-file, aiming to contest its control. Opening up the d-file with this capture initiates a direct challenge for control of the central pawn structure, potentially simplifying into an endgame where white's knight on g6 might prove a persistent nuisance, though it also concedes the central pawn advance that black was clearly preparing. Regaining the pawn opens up the b-file, creating an immediate tactical opportunity to exploit white's doubled c-pawns and potentially disrupt their queenside structure. Unleashing a knight to the kingside outposts after material exchange clears the central files, aiming to exploit the slightly weakened kingside pawn structure and potentially create threats around black's monarch. Black reclaims the pawn, a logical reaction to the knight's aggressive foray. This repositions the bishop to a more active square, eyeing potential breakthroughs on the queenside and offering better protection for the king's flank, while also preparing to contest the central open files that white has been so keen to control. Targeting the weak c5 pawn and preparing for a central clamp, white reorients their queen to a more active central square. A bold repositioning of the knight, seeking to untangle the central structure and perhaps prepare a later advance along the c-file, though it temporarily sacrifices some central presence. The rook's repositioning to the d-file aims to exert pressure on black's weakened central pawn structure, particularly if black fails to adequately defend the d5 pawn. This also prepares for potential exchanges on d5, which could open lines for white's remaining pieces and exploit the semi-open nature of the c-file for the queen. It's a move that breathes life into white's position, seeking to exploit the lingering tension and offer black difficult choices regarding pawn defense and piece development. Initiating a central pawn thrust to shatter white's pawn structure and potentially open lines for your pieces. Seizing the initiative, white's bishop retreats, eyeing the dark squares and offering a flexible defensive post on the kingside, ready to participate in a potential queenside expansion or simply reinforce the central structure. Dislodging that central bishop immediately simplifies the position, aiming to exploit the weakened dark squares around white's king and potentially creating opportunities on the queenside by clearing the d-file. The monarch is forced to wander, opening its defenses to white's coordinated pieces. This checks black's central pawn majority and threatens to expose the king further, creating a dangerous dynamic for the defending side. Preserving the king's sanctuary while simultaneously preparing for a potential defensive reshuffle seems to be the primary intention behind relocating the monarch to a more sheltered square, aiming to escape the immediate crossfire of the queen's assertion. Unlocking lines for attack, white's pawn thrust on the queenside initiates a positional gambit to fracture black's structure and seize initiative along the newly opened b-file. Now the black knight embarks on an ambitious journey, steering towards the queenside where its presence might disrupt white's pawn structure or establish a powerful outpost. This maneuver attempts to activate a dormant piece and inject some much-needed dynamism into black's position, potentially creating imbalances that can be exploited later. A bold foray into enemy territory, the knight now aggressively targets key squares around the black king, aiming to disrupt coordination and potentially create mating threats, while the pawn structure on the queenside is simultaneously being undermined. Finally, black breaks the siege on the queenside, liberating the knight with a bold repositioning, seeking a more active role in the center and potentially disrupting white's carefully constructed pawn chain. This maneuver offers a breath of fresh air after a period of defensive play, aiming to inject dynamism into black's position. The relentless pressure on black's king is amplified as the queen forces a square dance across the board. Unleashing a desperate gambit, black injects chaos by sacrificing material to disrupt white's queenly procession and awaken dormant attacking potential along the now open d-file. The knight's journey to d8, a seemingly aggressive capture, actually liberates black's queen and opens a dangerous diagonal for her, potentially reigniting the pressure on white's king and even targeting the now exposed pawn on c5 if white isn't careful. The queen's repositioning to the center, while seemingly aggressive, exposes it to immediate tactical threats and fails to address the critical issue of white's advanced knight on e6. This move signals a premature shift from the dynamic complications of the middle game towards an uncertain endgame where white's central dominance and king's safety remain superior. Securing the queen's maneuver with QB2 clears the path for white's rooks to dominate the now open b-file, aiming to exploit the queenside pawn structure and potentially create passed pawns later in the endgame. Unleashing a pawn storm on the queenside, black seeks to generate dynamic counterplay by expanding on this wing, aiming to destabilize white's coordination and create new avenues for attack. Solidifying the pawn chain and preparing for the endgame struggle, this subtle repositioning prepares for potential pawn advances on the kingside while preventing any immediate breakthroughs for black's scattered pieces. The queen reasserts its influence on the queenside, aiming to disrupt white's coordinated pieces and potentially create threats on the c-file. Asserting influence on the queenside flank, this maneuver aims to challenge black's burgeoning pawn presence and potentially liberate white's rook. Unleashing the pawn chain's momentum, this aggressive push aims to disrupt white's defensive structure and create dynamic play on the kingside, potentially opening lines for black's remaining pieces to participate in the attack, even at the cost of some pawn weaknesses. Securing the monarch's flank before launching an attack on the queenside offers a crucial layer of defensive stability. The monarch endeavors to escape the immediate pressure on the kingside, seeking a more secure haven while white's queenside pawn advances. Opening the queen's diagonal offers a fascinating opportunity for white to exploit the newly created central pawn structure by initiating a queenside pawn storm to gain space and potentially crack open black's defenses. Unleashing a pawn to break the blockade, black boldly challenges white's centralized control and aims to pry open the queenside. Seizing the open file with the rook is a crucial step, aiming to exploit the newly liberated d-file and pressure black's vulnerable queen and pawn chain. Black's sacrifice of the knight on d3 opens a Pandora's box of complications, aiming to disrupt white's central control and exploit the exposed d-file. This daring exchange creates a powerful passed pawn on c3, a constant thorn that could become a decisive force if white is not exceedingly careful. The immediate consequence is the liberation of black's queen, now poised to threaten the weak squares around the white king. However, this also leaves black's own king somewhat vulnerable, a tactical gamble that requires precise follow-up to justify the material deficit. The opposition is now firmly established, forcing a dramatic confrontation as the white queen sweeps in for a crucial check.